Hi, I'm Mike, and I'd like to welcome you to this brief introduction to liminal coaching. Our approach is designed to reduce stress and reactivity and to nurture your ability to develop in the way that you would like to. Liminal coaching sessions are divided into two sections. In the first section, we discuss with you the plan, exactly what it is you want to achieve, and where you feel you are with it and how you're getting on since we last spoke. Then we would move on to a second section called What's Been Good, and in the What's Been Good section we actually ask you to think about at least 6 things which have been great in your past week. There's a very good reason for this, which is that it actually reduces the blood supply to something called the amygdala, which is the decision-making part of the primitive brain. And what I'm going to do now is to go through a short description of the model of the brain that we use for liminal coaching, and I'm going to do that with the help of a drawing kindly provided by my friend and colleague Dave Gray. So first of all, we have something called the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is pretty much what we think of as I. It is the part of the brain that we use to relate to one another. It's the part we're using to relate to one another right now. And most of the time, that prefrontal cortex is attached primarily to a vast intellectual resource, which maps pretty much onto the neocortex, which we call the higher brain or the intellectual brain. And this is the part of our brain which distinguishes us from most of the other animals. Now, interestingly, when we're working from this part of the brain, we generally get things right in our lives, because the higher brain is very good at making a realistic assessment of circumstances and situations we find ourselves in. And it's also generally pretty positive and very good at coming up with innovative solutions. And that's great. However, we also have another brain which predates the higher brain, which we call the primitive brain, which is centered on the amygdala, sometimes called the flight-fight response center. The hippocampus, which stores a lot of patterns, some of them programmed genetically, some of them by experience, which the amygdala uses to check against to identify threats. And then there's the hypothalamus, which controls the flow of various neurotransmitters and hormones and stuff in the body and the brain. Now, obviously, this is a pretty simplified model, but it is based on pretty good neuroscience, so we're reasonably happy that it's fit for purpose. It's good enough for us to work with for the purposes of our discussion. I'll look at this model of the brain and talk a bit about what it means for us as we go through our day-to-day life, and I think that you'll see the relevance to how we use this model in liminal coaching. So to look at how it works, the thing about the primitive brain is that it actually knows only how to do 3 things. It has 3 responses really: depression, anxiety and anger. And they're all negative. And so if you were to leave here today and you ran into a polar bear, what would happen? Well, the sensory data would arrive at your amygdala first and would immediately find a pattern match, telling it that this is a threat to life. Your anxiety would go up, you'd lose intellectual control, and you'd move from the intellectual brain to the primitive emotional brain. And because of the threat, your heartbeat would increase, stomach churn, you'd be flooded with adrenaline, and you'd be off like a shot. At this point, the primitive brain has released cortisol into your system, and actually if it is enough cortisol that's released, it's perfectly capable of completely shutting down the activity of the higher brain. It's also worth noting that sensory data arrives at the amygdala before it goes to the higher brain, so the amygdala basically has first choice on what the response is going to be. Now, how sensitive the amygdala is in its response, how extreme its responses are to any pattern match that it gets, and how accurate its pattern match is before it reacts, is dependent on the amount of stress present in what we describe as being a stress reservoir. Obviously, this is a metaphor, but it is a great one. Basically, we accumulate stress throughout the day, but we do have a way of emptying it out during sleep. The response to the polar bear encounter would be perfectly appropriate, and it's exactly what you would want to happen, but it's not what you would want to happen in day-to-day life, and unfortunately The same thing can happen when our anxiety goes up. The primitive brain can react to a bad bank statement or a customer complaint as if it's a threat to life. The higher the level of accumulated stress in the stress reservoir, the more likely incoming sensory data will be interpreted as a threat. The accumulation of stress can be a gradual process. It can even happen over years, and stress can accumulate in the stress reservoir over decades sometimes. We can lose intellectual control, and to a greater or lesser extent the primitive brain can take over. Remember, that brain always responds with depression, anxiety or anger, or a combination of all three. And if our primitive brain thinks that for one reason or another our life is in some sort of crisis, it will move in to do what it thinks of as helping us. Another interesting thing to note about the primitive brain is that it's not an intellect and it can't be innovative. So it has to refer to previous patterns of behaviour. So if what we did yesterday ensured our survival, then we are encouraged to do it again today. If we stayed under the duvet yesterday and didn't get eaten, it will encourage us to do the same again today. And the higher brain may say, look, we've got to get up, we've got to get out, we've got to go to work, we've got to get the bus, the train or whatever, and make some money, otherwise we won't have a duvet to hide under. But the primitive brain doesn't care. Primitive brain says, no, it's nasty out there, it's full of dangerous things, and yesterday we stayed here and we stayed under the duvet and we were safe. And you can see how that would figure into people who get depressed, but it also operates in other ways. So, for example, if we made a huge profit from dumb phones yesterday or for the past decade, it will probably encourage us to do the same today. We're used to making billions of dollars a year from dumb phones, and we've been doing that for the past 10 years or more. And then there's these new smartphones, this new technology. It's pretty scary. It's a risk to be investing in. So the primitive brain will say, hey, just carry on doing what you were doing before. It was safe. We've been doing well. Just keep going. And that's how you turn a 40% market share of the mobile phone handset market into a 4% market share in a few years. And from the point of view of accumulating stress, it's interesting to know that the mind can't always tell the difference between imagination and reality. So every negative thought you have is actually converted into anxiety and adds stress to the stress reservoir. We can create anxiety by negatively forecasting the future. So it can be big things like we'll never make our targets, or I'll never find another job, or I'll never have a baby, or whatever. Or it can be small things like a meeting. Intellectually, you may know the meeting is going to be fine. They generally are. But maybe you start thinking about what can go wrong, and you think about it going wrong 50 times. Well, the actual meeting goes quite well. But you've been to 51 meetings, and 50 have been a disaster. And all of the stress from those imagined disasters adds stress to your stress reservoir. The same thing happens when we negatively introspect about the past, and all of that is accumulated and stored, and the more of it there is, the more likely you are to experience what has been colourfully described as an amygdala hijack, when there's a response from the primitive brain and it pretty much takes over and says it's a threat, it's an absolute threat, and just responds to patterns stored in the hippocampus. For example, I knew a guy who had a very, very bad boss for 4 years, and at the end of that 4 years, he had been programmed. His primitive brain had been programmed with a pattern in the hippocampus which said, bosses will undermine you, they will make you feel bad, and they will treat you really badly. So subsequently, he got a great boss, but as soon as the guy came up to him and said, "Hi Sam, how are you doing? How's it going with that piece of work? Do you need any help? Do you need any extra resources?" It was immediately identified as being a threat. And I'm pretty sure from the experience I've had doing coaching for a while now that that's not uncommon, that those experiences in many organisations aren't that uncommon, and that's one of the things that we can help with. One of the reasons that we've developed liminal coaching is to provide a way for people to get past that kind of stuff, but also to be able to free up their really creative intellectual brain by reducing the stress load and reducing the likelihood of the amygdala reacting to incoming data wrongly and considering it to be a threat when actually it isn't. And this can be incredibly important if you're looking at things such as culture change and you're looking at situations where it's vital to rethink what an organization's doing. And that is so often in situations which are pretty high stress. It's usually because something isn't going too well, and it's exactly that kind of situation where you need to feel that you can get into a safe space and reconceive what you're doing without it being seen as a threat to survival by the primitive brain. And that's one of the items that we've been working with quite successfully. So with liminal coaching, what we do is we run through this model in the initial consultation and how it relates to what you want to do. We run through the model of the brain and we explain this stuff as part of the coaching process, because it is really important that you have a clear idea of how it works and what it's meant to do. So we go through the what's been good part of the session and ask you to think about those 6 things which have been great in the past week. And of course, if you wanted to do that right now, you could actually think about 6 things which have been great in the past week and write them down. And as you're doing that, each time you think about something you've really enjoyed or something which has been pretty nice or pretty cool about the past week, you will actually be decreasing the blood supply to your amygdala, and you will be focusing more of your attention in the prefrontal cortex, which generally tends to be pretty positive, solutions-focused type of place to be. Now, after you've been through the what's been good items, we would look at and ask you to think about things which may actually fit into the model of the brain that we've just discussed. So did you have an encounter with somebody during the week which was tense or aggressive? Did they start being aggressive with you, or did they ask you something which made you jump and start being defensive? Because if so, then you're pretty certain to be looking at the reaction of the primitive brain. And I think it's probably true that in lots of organizations, a great deal of the interchange which happens between people is based on primitive brain thinking and primitive brain responses, even if they have a veneer of logic and good thinking above that. This is one of the things that we'll ask you to think about, is if there's anything like that. Does it map onto the model that we've been talking about, and can you see how relevant it is to what you want to achieve and where you want to go? And the next part of the first half of the session uses a technique taken from solutions-focused brief therapy, and it's called the miracle question. It was developed by a great woman called Insoo Kim Berg, and basically it goes like this. If you think about where it is that you would like to really be, where you really want to get to, where's the next place you want to get to? Either with your life or your career, with your job, whatever. What does it look like and how does it feel? And then the question is this. If you went to sleep tonight and a little miracle or a wonderful event happened overnight that you weren't aware of, and you woke up tomorrow morning and you were a significant step closer to that wonderful goal that you have, that you're thinking about now, I hope, what would it look like? What would it feel like? And what would you be doing? And we will actually circle around that question a few times until the client comes up with a very clear image of a place, of a time, and of a specific situation and how they would feel and what they would be doing in that place at that time. And the reason that we do that is because there's a part of your brain called the anterior cingulate. In John Ratey's book, The Brain, a User's Guide, he describes it with a useful metaphor as being the super secretary. And when you create a very clear, definite image of something that you want to have happen in a particular place at a particular time, the anterior cingulate will spend time while you're asleep, idle, daydreaming, going around and organising every single mental resource that you need for that, whether it's a particular kind of feeling, a particular kind of drive, a particular bunch of memories, a particular set of information that you need to have at your fingertips. It will get it all ready and ready for you to go. And I'm sure if you've done any public speaking or you've done presentations, you're familiar with the phenomenon of going to sleep, and just before you go to sleep you're thinking to yourself, okay, tomorrow at 10 I'm going to be in the office and I'm going to do this and I'm going to have the slides ready and I'm going to go through it and it's going to be absolutely perfect. And when you actually get up, you may have a little bit of tension, but when you get to actually do it, everything is right there, ready for you to go. And that's what the anterior cingulate does. So in the session, we use that phenomenon in conjunction with the miracle question to get you to visualize very, very clearly what's the next step forward for you in where you want to go. Whether it's your career, your life journey, or your relationships, home, whatever. It really doesn't matter, because our interest is in coaching the whole person, and all of these things interlock. The second half of the session involves you completely relaxing and letting yourself drift along with a narrative scenario which is designed to calm the primitive brain down even more and to put you into a daydream state, very much like REM sleep. In this state, which is highly enjoyable, I should add, guided imagery is used both to reduce stress levels and to provide imaginary fields where your own solutions and insights can grow and flourish. Because the subconscious uses metaphor as a language, we employ metaphorical scenarios and modify them depending on our discussions in the first half of the session. This should leave you feeling refreshed and relaxed and continue to work at a subconscious level in between sessions. So that's pretty much it for a brief introduction to liminal coaching. We will cover some more areas in greater detail as appropriate when you start your sessions, and I really look forward to working with you in the near future. Thanks for taking the time to watch this introduction.